Welcome to The Debate. Imagine a violent, unforgiving desert, where heavily armed factions are locked in these
Endless generational blood feuds.
exactly endless blood feuds. Survival in this landscape depends entirely on projecting strength, right? Never showing vulnerability. Now, imagine a single bare-bones structure in the middle of all this chaos, where those same fierce warriors instantly, voluntarily drop their weapons.
The second they cross an invisible line in the sand.
Right, so today we are looking at the pre-Islamic Kaaba and Late Antiquity. And we're grounding this discussion strictly in modern historical reconstructions, comparative archaeological evidence, and academic analyses.
Yes, setting aside later theological claims, just to ask a purely historical question. What was the true source of this sanctuary's immense power in a profoundly fractured peninsula?
Right, and I will be arguing that this space was, above all, the ultimate geopolitical tool. The Kaaba's enduring power was fundamentally socio-political and, economic.
Acting as a cartel, essentially.
Exactly. An international court of arbitration and the center of a brilliant, economically driven cartel that maintained the balance of power in Western Arabia.
Well, I will counter that you really cannot build a cartel on a foundation of sand. I'm going to argue that those socio-economic infrastructures were strictly secondary. The Kaaba's authority was rooted in its intrinsic, overwhelming cosmic and sacred gravity.
Okay, so functioning as a spiritual center first.
Right, an ancient lithic center and the absolute spiritual navel of the earth. The standard narrative of a simplistic, pagan temple utterly fails to explain the sheer gravity of this site.
Well, let me outline my position by painting a picture of the material realities of late antique Arabia. We're talking about a society completely devoid of a centralized state, right? No police force, no overarching legal system.
Just tribal alliances.
Exactly. Intertribal warfare and the cycle of vengeance, the blood feud, was the default condition for survival. If someone from your tribe was killed, you had to kill someone from the offending tribe, or you projected a fatal weakness.
Right, it's a brutal environment.
Incredibly brutal. And in that environment, the Kaaba was the essential political infrastructure that kept society from completely tearing itself apart. The key mechanism here is the concept of the Hauta.
The neutral enclave?
Right. A strictly enforced neutral enclave, administered by a holy custodian family, in this case, the Quraysh. Within the boundaries of this sanctuary, all violence, all hunting, and all blood feuds were legally suspended.
But you're saying they weaponized it.
Masterfully. They didn't just administer a peace park, they turned these rules into a socio-religious cartel known as the Hums. They turned a local boundary line into a highly lucrative monopoly.
A monopoly on trade, you mean?
Exactly. The sanctuary created a safe zone, the safe zone created a centralized market, and the Quraysh utterly controlled the terms of that trade.
See, I come at it from a completely different way. The economic and political machinations of the Quraysh only functioned because the Kaaba was already an unassailable sacred landscape.
But they exploited it.
Sure, but the spiritual awe absolutely had to precede the economic exploitation. Arabian religion in late antiquity was deeply place-centered, not building-centered. The Kaaba was viewed as the omphalos.
The navel of the world.
Right, the precise coordinate where creation itself began. Long before the Quraysh leveraged it for trade, this space commanded an absolute spiritual terror through its deep Arabian Lithic culture.
Meaning the sacred stones?
Exactly. We are talking about the profound veneration of raw, uncarved sacred stones and highly specific astral alignments. The Quraysh didn't invent the sacredness of the Kaaba to make money.
They just capitalized on it?
They made money because the cosmic gravity of the site forced even the most violent tribes into submission before the landscape itself.
I see why you think that, but, let me give you a different perspective on this so-called cosmic gravity. Because if this specific coordinate in the Hijaz was the undeniable center of the universe, we run headfirst into a massive historical blind spot.
Ah, the invisibility problem.
Exactly. When we look at the surviving contemporary records of the surrounding superpowers in late antiquity, the Byzantine, Sasanian Persian, or Syriac empires, there is absolute silence. The Kaaba is entirely unmentioned in those imperial records until the early 8th century.
But they were looking for different things.
Even so, Furthermore, from a purely historical and archaeological perspective, there is currently an absence of independent evidence confirming an ancient Abrahamic origin. To me, this silence proves the Kaaba was merely a localized internal tribal arbitration zone.
Just a local treaty spot.
Right. Think of a modern diplomatic backchannel. It doesn't need to be a flashy United Nations building in New York to hold immense geopolitical weight for the people using it. Its bare-bones nature was practical and functional, heavily utilized by local actors, but completely invisible to the empires because it wasn't a cosmic portal.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that you are applying a strictly imperial metric to a landscape that operated on entirely different terms?
How so?
You mentioned a flashy UN building, and I think that perfectly highlights the bias here. Let's look at the actual architecture of the Kaaba before Islam. For most of its early history, it was an unroofed, open-air rectangular enclosure made of simple dry stone masonry.
Very simple.
Right, and it stood in stark contrast to the grand, multi-story architectural marvels of southern Arabia. Think of the towering Gundan Palace in Sana'a, or the magnificent Christian cathedral Al-Khalis built by the Aksumite king Abraha.
Okay, so it was deliberately bare bones.
Yes, it was deliberately simple. Its lack of imperial attention and architectural grandeur isn't a sign of insignificance. It is the exact proof that its power came from the earth itself.
Wait, how does being a pile of unmortared rocks prove cosmic power? I mean, that's quite a leap.
Because the building was almost irrelevant compared to the specific coordinates it occupied. This is the concept of the omphalos, and those coordinates were astoundingly precise.
You're talking about the astral alignments.
Cardinal directions and the rising of the star Canopus. In a desert society that navigated the lethal, featureless sands by reading the night sky, this is a profound astral alignment.
But why the silence from the empires then?
The Byzantine and Persian empires didn't write about it because their historians were obsessed with gold, massive standing armies, and walled cities. They completely lacked the cultural vocabulary to understand that the spiritual center of the Arabian Peninsula was an open-air enclosure aligned with the heavens.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. The deliberate simplicity, the unroofed dry stone masonry, that doesn't automatically mean astral perfection or an omphalos.
What else would it mean?
It can simply mean a practical, low-resource society marking out a functional zone, a boundary line for arbitration. Doesn't require a roof, it just requires a visible marker.
Sure, but it doesn't explain the alignments.
Maybe. But regarding the Byzantine and Persian silence, you're right, that empires care about money and borders. But the fact that their extensive trade networks and spies didn't notice Mecca tells us something crucial.
Which is?
It tells us that its economic cartel, while deeply effective internally for the tribes of the Hijaz, was a localized political phenomenon. The Quraysh were managing tribal feuds, not maintaining a cosmic navel.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. If this was just a localized arbitration center, a mere boundary line for signing treaties, how do you explain the spiritual intensity of what was housed inside and around that enclosure?
You mean the idols?
Yes, Islamic tradition famously records that there were roughly 360 idols associated with the Kaaba. But we have to be very careful here not to project a Greek-style museum of statues onto late antique Arabia.
Wait, let's pause there to clarify this for a moment, because this is crucial. When we say idols, we need to completely erase the image of a beautifully carved marble Zeus from our minds, right?
Exactly. The epigraphic and archaeological data shows that Arabian polytheism was overwhelmingly achonic. They were venerating Bethels or Ansab.
These were the standing stones.
Right. Sacred standing stones, raw, unshaped blocks of basalt and meteorites that fell from the sky. The terror comes from the fact that they were unshaped by human hands.
So the black stone would be an example of this.
Yes. The famous black stone, which survived into the Islamic era, was not an anomaly. It was the ultimate expression of a deeply terrifying and awe-inspiring Lithic culture.
But they weren't worshiping the building itself.
No, pre-Islamic Arabs did not worship the physical stones of the Kaaba itself. But these baytales served as physical anchor points where the divine presence, the Sakina, actually made contact with the human world.
And you think this drove the pilgrimage?
Absolutely.
The tribes didn't travel hundreds of kilometers across lethal, unpoliced deserts just to sign a peace treaty. They came because those stones represented an undeniable, raw, dangerous divine presence.
See, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it completely ignores the political brilliance of what the Quraysh actually did with those stones.
I don't think it ignores it, it just contextualizes it.
Well, let's accept your premise for a second. Let's accept that they were raw, terrifying meteorites and unshaped basalt. Let's accept the Lithic culture. Why were there exactly 360 of them?
Exactly.
Whether that number is literal, representing one sacred stone for dozens of different tribes, or symbolic of a complete calendar cycle, it represents a massive political mechanism. It was a federation of cults.
You are reducing an ontological reality to a political convention.
But look at the mechanics of it. By housing the sacred stones of dozens of disparate, politically independent tribes within one single enclosure, the Quraysh effectively created a spiritual hostage system.
A hostage system?
Think about the how of this piece. If a rival tribe attacked Mecca, they weren't just attacking a bustling market. They were attacking the very house where their own god lived.
So it deterred violence?
Yes, it was mutual assured destruction, but on a spiritual level. By bringing their Ba'ethels to the Kaaba, the tribes were physically depositing their tribal sovereignty into a neutral zone.
But they brought them because of the inherent sanctity of the place.
And furthermore, if the stones were purely cosmic, purely terrifying manifestations of divine power with no earthly tether, why do modern scholars note that certain deities like Hubal, Al-Uzza, Al-Lat, and Manat were clearly more influential than others?
Well, there's always a hierarchy.
Right, but doesn't this exact hierarchy of the gods perfectly mirror the earthly geopolitical power dynamics of the tribes that championed them?
The hierarchy of deities naturally reflects human social structures, yes. But that doesn't strip them of their secret terror.
It makes them awfully convenient, though.
It's on the desks of tribal delegates.
Kind of, yeah.
That fundamentally misunderstands the psychology of ancient Near Eastern thought. The tribes didn't revere Hubal because the Quraysh offered them a good trade deal in exchange for keeping a stone there.
Then why did they?
They revered Hubal because they believed that entity could actively influence their survival, bring rain, or curse their lineage in a brutally unforgiving environment.
I admit the spiritual intensity is hard to quantify for a modern mind. But let's look at how that environment was actually managed on the ground.
Sure, let's look at the management.
You say they revered the power of the gods, but the Quraysh structured that reverence into a very earthly, very profitable, and highly manipulative system. I want to look at the transition from this sacred awe you describe into the Hauta system and the Homs cartel.
Okay.
Inside the sanctuary, blood feuds were suspended.
Because of the terror of divine retribution?
Not just that.
Yes. Heavily armed, violently competitive Bedouin tribes would not drop their weapons for a marketplace. You couldn't pay a Bedouin warrior enough to put down his sword. If a man from a rival clan who killed his brother was standing 20 feet away.
But they did put down their swords.
Exactly. The entire honor code of their society demanded vengeance. They laid down their arms solely out of an overwhelming fear of violating the sacred landscape. The Hauta proves the absolute supremacy of religious reverence over human politics.
So religion dictated the terms.
Religion dictated the terms of peace, not the other way around.
Hold on. You're telling me that blood-feuding warriors, whose entire survival depended on projecting strength and exacting revenge, just voluntarily disarmed because they were standing near a rock?
A sacred rock.
I find that incredibly hard to believe without an enormous economic incentive and a heavily regulated enforcement mechanism. And that is exactly what the Quraysh built with the Homs alliance.
They were custodians of the sanctuary.
They didn't just sit back and let the cosmic aura do the work. They formed a strict religious federation alongside their tribal allies. They claimed special status, enforcing unique purity laws. And here is where the brilliance of the cartel truly emerges.
How is a purity law a cartel?
Because the Quraysh decreed that any outside pilgrim coming to perform the circumambulation around the Kaaba, the tawaf, could not do so in their own everyday clothes, which were deemed polluted by secular life and bloodshed.
Purity laws and the separation of the profane from the sacred are a universal feature of holy spaces. That doesn't make it a cartel.
But let's really look at the enforcement of those purity laws. It wasn't just a suggestion to wash up.
Outsiders were strictly forbidden from using their own garments, so they were forced to buy expensive, specialized ritual garments manufactured exclusively by Meccan traders.
It was a requirement for entering the sacred space.
And here is the kicker. If a pilgrim could not afford the marked-up Meccan attire, they were legally forced to perform the tawaf completely naked.
Oh, wow. It sounds shocking today, yes.
Think about the psychology of that. This isn't just religion. This is a 6th century monopoly. It's like a theme park telling you that you absolutely cannot bring outside food in. But the penalty for trying is public humiliation.
I think comparing the Kaaba to a theme park is a bit reductive.
It is a highly sophisticated economic trap wrapped in holy packaging, using the excuse of ritual purity to enforce an absolute monopoly on the ritual economy of the Hijaz. It proves that pragmatism, economics, and control drove the sanctuary's operational success. Religion was just the packaging, the monopoly was the product.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the glaring flaw in that logic?
Which is?
You are looking at the hums and seeing a mafia shakedown. And honestly, on paper, from a purely modern economic lens, it looks exactly like one. But that ignores the psychology of the fiercely proud people they were allegedly shaking down.
How does it ignore them?
You have to ask, why did the outside tribes comply? Why did fierce, independent, heavily armed warriors agree to humiliate themselves by walking naked around a dry stone enclosure if they couldn't afford the cloth?
Because the Quraysh had built a massive coalition. And if they didn't comply, they would be locked out of the only safe trading zone in Western Arabia.
No, if it was purely an economic cartel, a powerful rival tribe would have simply formed their own coalition, slaughtered the Quraysh, and taken the sanctuary by force to run the monopoly themselves.
They couldn't risk the mutual assured destruction we talked about.
They didn't do it because the ontologic reality of the Falaz, the unquestionable sacredness of the space, was so overwhelming that they accepted the Quraysh as the legitimate holy custodians.
I just don't buy the overwhelming awe argument.
They accepted the humiliation of the naked tawaf because they truly believed their own clothes were ritually impure before the divine presence. The economic monopoly was a secondary byproduct of an absolute spiritual monopoly.
So the sacredness came first.
The Quraysh didn't invent the sanctity of the Kaaba to sell clothes. They sold clothes because the Kaaba was already undeniably sacred. The awe forced the compliance.
Well, if the Quraysh built an economic engine this perfect, it explains exactly why early Islam made the most counterintuitive decision in the history of conquering religions.
The retention of the Kaaba.
Exactly. Let's look at the historical climax of this space. Conquering religious movements almost always level the temples of their predecessors. They burned them down and built something entirely new on the ruins to signal a new era.
That is typically true, yes.
But when early Islam consolidated its power over Mecca, they did not destroy the Kaaba, they kept it. This was a masterstroke of pragmatic governance.
Pragmatism?
By retaining the building, the sacred months, the pilgrimage, and the circumambulation, they co-opted the ultimate symbol of Arabian tribal legitimacy.
I think that's quite cynical.
They took the peninsula's most effective piece of political economy, cleared out the 360 idols, the old tribal hostage system, and repurposed the entire infrastructure to stabilize a new, rapidly expanding empire. It was brilliant structural recycling.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it was mere structural recycling. That reduces one of the most profound theological and cultural transformations in late antiquity to a cynical political acquisition.
But functionally, that's what happened. Drawing on the work of scholars like Angelica Neuwirth and Fred Donner, the retention of the Kaaba demonstrates profound spiritual continuity, not just political repurposing. Early Islam demonstrates continuity alongside innovation rather than a total historical rupture. But the meaning changed entirely. It went from a polytheistic tribal center to the focal point of strict monotheism.
The theological narrative changed, yes. The Quran deeply engages with existing ritual practice while fundamentally reshaping its interpretation.
Exactly. Reshaping it.
But the rituals were retained, precisely because the physical topography held undeniable cosmic significance. Take the tawaf, the circumambulation we mentioned earlier.
walking around the structure.
That circular, counterclockwise motion is deeply tied to the astral alignments we discussed. It is an ancient practice of imitating the rotation of the heavens around a fixed center.
So Islam just adopted an astral ritual?
Early Islam didn't just pragmatically co-opt a cartel's theme park. It demythologized the stars, it cleared out the polytheistic Bythals, and it shifted the focus of worship from the cosmos to the creator of the cosmos.
Right.
But it fundamentally recognized that the location itself, the Ompolos, was genuinely sacred.
Yet, if the physical location was so cosmically vital, why does the Quran spend almost no time describing the physical architecture of the building itself?
Because the dry stone building didn't matter. What mattered was re-anchoring that specific sacred topography back to the universal monotheistic narrative of Abraham.
Changing the narrative, not the location.
The spiritual awe was preserved. Only the direction of it changed. The power was always in the sacred landscape, not the masonry.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because the Quran's lack of architectural description actually supports the idea that the physical structure was just a vessel for social organization.
How does silence support that?
The text focuses intensely on concepts: the purification of the space, the rules of the pilgrimage, the establishment of a safe haven. It focuses on exactly the elements that provided social cohesion.
Which were originally rooted in awe.
Maybe, but Islam redefined the identity of the sanctuary to unite the warring tribes under a new monotheistic banner, achieving exactly what the Homs cartel achieved in terms of maintaining peace and stability, but on a massive universal scale.
So it's still just politics to you?
They didn't need the cosmic terror of meteorites anymore. They needed the political stability of the Qutaha to build a civilization.
We're clearly circling the same enclosure, looking at it from very different angles. To summarize my view, the sanctuary's enduring power was rooted in an ancient, undeniable cosmic and lithic resonance.
The navel of the earth.
Yes. Its astral alignments and deeply terrifying sacred stones dictated the terms of Arabian spirituality. This raw, divine presence forced even the most violent, heavily armed Bedouin tribes into submission before the landscape itself.
Right.
The economics, the Homs alliance, the diplomacy, none of that functions unless the spiritual terror is absolutely real to the people practicing it.
And to summarize my perspective, the Kaaba was a masterful piece of political and economic infrastructure. Through the Hauta system and the Homs cartel, the Quraysh provided a necessary, heavily regulated diplomatic zone that kept a fractured, stateless Arabia functioning.
The hostage system.
Yes, the 360 idols were a federation of cults, ensuring mutual political investment. A spiritual hostage system that enforced the peace. It was a brilliantly pragmatic geopolitical tool which early Islam wisely retained and repurposed to unite an empire.
Well, what we certainly converge on is that the pre-Islamic Kaaba was never just a simplistic pagan temple. It was a deeply complex, multi-layered phenomenon.
Very true.
And we both recognize that early Islam's approach to it was one of brilliant structural continuity rather than total historical rupture.
Absolutely. Understanding the distinction between sacred history and historical reconstruction is vital to unpacking late antiquity. There is so much more to uncover in this material.
Particularly regarding how the exact origins of daily Islamic rituals connect back to these ancient Arabian roots.
Exactly.
Indeed. When we look closely, the past rarely offers us clean breaks, only profound transformations.
Which brings us back to that invisible line in the sand we started with. When the most violent forces on Earth drop their weapons at a boundary, we are left to ponder. Is it the sheer brilliance of human pragmatism, or an undeniable spiritual awe that is the true engine of historical longevity? Thank you for joining us.